Well, good evening. Hope everybody had a nice afternoon. I think it got a little warmer, a little less snow on the ground as I was coming in. This evening, I thought we'd talk about the idea of fear, and that I think we often, if we're honest with ourselves, we find ourselves being paralyzed by fear. While fear can be helpful, we see from the scriptures, like in Matthew 10, verse 28, that we need a wholesome fear of the Lord. That would be a good fear. Or a fear of danger, kind of like the innate fear of snakes. Um, I'm fearful of snakes, or I don't want to get too close to them. Some of those things are there for a purpose, and they can be helpful. On the flip side, fear can also be harmful. Can make us cowardly. That's what Revelations 21 and 8 points out. Fear can literally paralyze one. And that's what we see here in the text. Our proof text is Matthew chapter 28 and verse 4. Of course, the scene here is the day of Christ being resurrected from the tomb. And Mary Magdalene and Mary came to the tomb. And in verse 2 it says, "And behold, there was a great earthquake, for the angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came and rolled back the stone from the door and sat on it. His countenance was like lightning, and his clothing was white as snow." And in verse 4 is our proof text. It says, "And the guards shook for fear of him and became like dead men." In other words, they became pale. They became white themselves. And then it goes on. So here we see that the guards had become paralyzed by fear, by what they saw on the angel of the Lord. And so, that's what we want to look at here. Fear has paralyzed many of us in various areas of responsibility throughout our life. And we're going to look at a few areas, and of course, this is not an exhaustive list, but hopefully we can take away from it that we shouldn't allow ourselves to become paralyzed by fear. Now, I understand for some that might be harder to get over than others. I don't want to pick on my mom too much, but she's been stricken by fear of her health, and it's really gotten her down. It's easy to tell somebody, it's easy for somebody who doesn't suffer about that stuff to say, "Oh, don't worry about it." But for her, that just goes through one ear and out the other. She can't help but to worry about it. And I guess what my takeaway is that we have to condition ourselves how to not be paralyzed by fear. The only people that can help us, I think, really get over fear, especially that of a harmful fear, a fear that paralyzes at the point that we should not be paralyzed, is us in and of ourselves. I remember once when my daughter was younger, we packed up our bikes. Each of us had a bike, and we thought we would go to the Pigeon Forge, Gatlinburg area and do some biking trips. And we would pedal through Kate's Cove. And my daughter hadn't been riding very long, but it had been a couple years, but she never really was a real bike-oriented girl. And so we started out and we went up the first hill, and I remember her starting to go down the descent. It really wasn't that big of a hill, but the bike got to going faster and faster, and then all of a sudden she became paralyzed with fear. And I can remember riding right beside her, telling her to squeeze on her brake, squeeze your brake. And she could not move. Her eyes was, as big as, coffee cups. And all she could do is, look straight ahead. She was white like the guards in the text, and she for all that she could do, she could not squeeze those brakes. She could not remember to apply her brakes. So the only thing she could come up with was to sway over and go into the weeds. And of course, she wrecked once she went into there. But it was a soft landing. But needless to say, that I think that's a good example of a paralyzing fear that was not good. And if she would just had soundness of mind just to reach up on her handlebars and squeeze those brakes, she would have been fine. But instead, she panicked, became stricken, and couldn't do that. And so let's look at some aspects where we might find ourselves being paralyzed by fear. I would argue that parents are often paralyzed by fear. Now, what I mean by paralyzed by fear in this context is not that they freeze up like what my daughter did, but they often, in the weakness of their moments, they weigh the pros and cons of their decision making and they go with the bad decision. And I think you'll see this as we go on. One is that they're afraid to insist on the morality standards set forth in the Bible, and they yield to that of the standards of society, whether it be in improper clothing, improper swimming and bathing, improper attendance to activities that bring about lasciviousness, school dances, those type of things. I think we often, that when it comes to for some parents, when it comes to their children, they tend to throw out the Bible and just go with what the kids want to go with. Whereas what we ought to remember is that we are charged to raise children in admonition of the Lord. That's what we find over there in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 4. It says, and you, fathers, do not provoke your children to wrath, but bring them up in training and admonition of the Lord. Notice that it doesn't say that you should bring them up and go wayward of the laws of God. Doesn't say that when your children come of age and want to go against what God has set forth, that you just cowtail and just let them do what they want to. No, it says that we are to bring them up in training and admonition of the Lord. Consider Galatians chapter 5, 19 through 21. It says, now the works of the flesh are evident, which are adultery, fornication, uncleanness, lewdness, idolatry, sorcery, hatred, contentions, jealousies, outbursts of wrath, selfish ambitions, dissensions, heresies, envy, murders, drunkenness, rivalries, and the like, of which I tell you beforehand, just as I told you in times past, for those who practice such things will not inherit the kingdom of God. So why is it that when it comes to our children, however, some blink a blind eye to the things that they practice? Whether it be fornication, lewdness, hatred, contentions, bad tempers, the outbursts of wrath, selfish ambitions. Instead of correcting, we end up being enablers of a lot of those behaviors. And silence is not the answer either. Silence is, in the Air Force, we often said, well, silence means acceptance. In other words, if you sent direction up the ladder, up the chain, and you didn't hear anything back, you usually carried out what you wanted to do, because probably what you was wanting to do might have been on the edge of, what was within reg and what was not within reg. So commanders wouldn't necessarily want to put their neck out and say, yeah, go against what the book says. They would just say, well, I'll leave it up to you to decide what you need to do. So, then they could have what they would call plausible deniability. And I think some parents are that way when it comes to their children. Well, I'm not going to ask where they've been so that I can have plausible deniability that I condone such actions. That's not the way we need to raise. I think that's not the way that we need to raise our children. Often we find ourselves afraid to make our children attend services. I think we've all heard this one, or know of others that use this pseudo logic. Well, I don't want them to grow up and resent coming to church, so therefore I'm not going to force them to come. I don't think that's good logic. I think if you think about it, they're just being paralyzed by fear. In other words, they're afraid of offending their children, or they're afraid they don't want to go through the argument, or whatever the case may be, whatever the justification that you put forth. However, when it comes to, they sure as heck will make them go to school, will they not? They don't have any problem yelling and screaming at them to get up out of bed to go to school. Or what about getting a job? At some point, all parents will say, no, you need to get a job. You're not going to be a leech around here all your life. Or what about when it comes to good hygiene, taking showers, keeping oneself cleansed and well-groomed and whatnot? We certainly don't have a problem in making them do that. Why is it that we thus then have a problem making them come to church? Maybe that's something that we ought to ask ourselves. We're afraid to have rules and enforce them by discipline. We become fearful of alienating our children from us. I think it's the complete opposite. I think kids are cunning. Matter of fact, not to bring popular psychology into the lesson, but I remember reading an article that they said by the age of 3 months that children could identify good from evil. And the way that they did this is that they used puppets. If they displayed a puppet with a smiley face and kind of a glowy kind of look to it, the children would often smile or wouldn't cry. However, if they put up a puppet that was black, kind of had a mean looking face, that scowl, or like a wicked witch or something, then all of a sudden, then the children would cry. So and where am I going with that? Well, they also say that children by the age of 3 months old can also rule their parents and giving them what they want through crying. That they learn that, well, if I cry enough, I'll get what I desire. And so I think the same thing goes as children get older and older. I think some kids sniff out, well, if I just tell mom that I hate her, then she's not going to make me do this. That's the last thing she wants to hear from me. And so they hold that against you. I don't think we should be fearful of alienating our children. Children can be mean and say things that are hateful in and of themselves. But I don't think they really really mean that. I think they're just trying to get what they want. But as soon as they realize that they're not going to get what they want, then they usually stand down. So we cannot measure effectiveness by present reaction too. Sometimes when we're exercising discipline, or sometimes when we're enforcing standards, and my dad can probably attest to this. Had many long discussions on things that I should or should not do as a teenager. However, once I got out of school and got into the military and I was out there all by myself, all I could remember is my dad talking to me in my head that I shouldn't be doing this and I shouldn't be doing that. And so he stuck with me through that young age, and instead of going out and experience the world and doing a lot of things that would have got me in a lot of trouble, he was there in spirit, if you will, to remind me of the things, how one is to conduct themselves and how one is not to conduct themselves. And so, so I think that's a takeaway here, that while the children might resent the enforcement of discipline at the time, there will become a time that they will appreciate that you made them do what they needed to do in order to be successful. That the light bulb will finally go on. Oh, dad wasn't trying to be mean to me. Mom wasn't trying to be mean to me. Mom and dad were trying to set me up for success. And now I see that. I heard it once said that, going through a young teenager, the parents are usually their worst friends, going through the adolescent phase of life. But then when they hit their early to mid 20s, then all of a sudden they come back and you're the greatest person that there ever was. You're the one that they're calling up and asking advice. How should I handle this? How should I do that? Because they've come to respect you and know that you are there to not tell them what they want to hear, but what they need to hear in order to be successful. And so we should not be discouraged and fearful of alienating our children, but we should actually instead be encouraged to stand on the Lord and raise them the way that they ought to be raised, and to hold them to the standards that they ought to be held to. Consider Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 7, where it says, "If you endure chastening, God deals with you as with sons. For what son is there whom a father does not chasten? But if you are without chastening, of which all have become partakers, then you are illegitimate and not sons. Furthermore, you have had human fathers who corrected us, and we paid them respect. Shall we not much more readily be in subjection to the Father of spirits and live? For they indeed for a few days chasten us as seemed best to them, but he for our profit, that we may be partakers of his holiness. Now no chastening seems to be joyful for the present, but painful. Nevertheless, afterward it yields a peaceable fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it." So just, if anything, remember verse 11. Now no chastening seems to be joyful at the present. Nobody likes being chastened. And that it says, but it's painful. And that's certainly true. Nevertheless, afterwards, it yields the peaceable fruit of righteousness. At what point, we don't know, but eventually it will, to those who have been trained by it. So instead of being paralyzed by fear, instead of being fearful and letting the children rule the nest, if you will, we need to train ourselves to not fall victim to those ploys, and to instead raise them in admonition of the Lord, to raise a God-fearing household, and do things that the way the Lord would have us to do. Another area that I think we often find ourselves paralyzed is that when we're Christians, we often become paralyzed. And you're probably sitting there, well, how's that? Well, I think often we find, especially when we begin We're afraid to partake in services. We're afraid that we're going to make a mistake. So I like to call upon. Would you like to do the prayer? No, no, no. I don't want to do that. Pick on somebody else. Or I don't like to do that. And I myself, granted, we were all novices at some point. At some point, every one of us first gave our first prayer. And I guarantee you, most of us, when we gave our first prayer, it probably wasn't a very good prayer, or it didn't sound like a very good prayer. But nonetheless, most of us did what? We gave another one, and then we gave another one, and then we gave another one. And then it starts becoming more natural. And then we start putting more thought into it. We start getting more comfortable with it. And before long, we're praying just as well as any other seasoned Christian has ever prayed before. Same way when it comes to tending on the partaking any aspect of the service. Same way when it comes to doing the invitation. That's I understand that public speaking for some is one of the most paralyzing fears that they may ever have. But the only way you can get over that fear is to what? Practice, practice, practice. Subject yourself to it. Growth only happens outside of what? The comfort zone. As long as you stay cocooned within the comfort zone, you are not growing. You are not growing as a Christian if you stay in your little comfort zone. We only grow when we step outside that comfort zone and we expose ourselves to new stimuli, i.e. partaking in the services. So what if you make a mistake? There's nothing wrong with making a mistake. That's how we learn. We don't learn from our successes, we learn from our mistakes. And just because we make a mistake, that's no big deal. It's repeated mistakes that become the issue often. So we shouldn't be fearful and not partake in things just because we're afraid we're going to make mistakes. We also need to not be worried about what the super critics are going to say about that. There are some brethren that always have something to say about something. And we should be careful about that. There's nothing wrong with constructive criticism. That's not what this is about. But there's also people that I just can't help themselves but to just make a snarky comment, if you will. Or, well, that was a good prayer, but brother so-and-so does it so much better. Well, why didn't you just stop where it was good prayer? Why did you have to add the other part? When we become super critics, we add to that fearfulness that paralyzes those brethren to participate. I've heard people say, well, I don't want to do that because I don't want to hear the comments from so-and-so. Because, sister so-and-so or brother so-and-so was a super critic. They always have something to say. And we shouldn't allow them to affect us, but I understand for some people that does affect them. And we ought to be really careful with that. And again, the only way that we can get over this fear is to what? Practice, practice, practice. Practice and be careful to do it right. If you're fearful of making mistakes, then just be more careful and practice more and more at home or wherever with the family to do it right. I don't know of anybody who's ever played an organized sport that just stepped on the field or stepped on the court and was instantly successful at it. No, it wasn't Canaan. He might think that he was. But everybody has to practice that discipline, if you will. There's not a player in the NFL, there's not a player in the NBA, there's not a player in the Major League Baseballs that hasn't spent thousands of hours in practicing his skill to hone it to be of that level of expertise. Same way when it comes to public speaking, same way when it comes to anything. There's no public speaker that just walks out onto the floor and starts speaking and has never spoke before. We might think that that's true, but that's not the reality. What we don't see all the practice behind the scenes that these people do. Yeah, they come out and they make it look very natural and they make it look like anybody can do it. But that's because they spent hours upon thousands of hours practicing their skill and honing it. And we can become just as skillful as they are if we put that much practice in what we are doing. And as far as when it comes to doing things right, yeah, we need to strive to do things right, and we should give God all the reverence that He is due. We shouldn't be lackadaisical about doing things. But God also realizes that we're human and that we will make mistakes. And guess what? It's okay. Look at the patriarchs. Look at some of the mistakes that they made, and it wasn't condoned. But they also had the right attitude about it, and they were often forgiven. We can also find ourselves being paralyzed when it comes time to speaking the truth to our brethren and our neighbors. Acts chapter 20, verse 7 says, "For I have not shunned to declare to you the whole counsel of God. We're afraid it will cause controversy." We know that our neighbor is practicing a false religion, if you will, but we don't want to bring that up, or we don't want to speak out against it for fear of hurting our relationship. So we become paralyzed. The early church survived controversy. That's what, Acts chapter 15, we just went through that with Ron's study of Acts. The Jerusalem Council, dealing with the Judaizing teachers, they overcame those things. They overcame the controversies with feeding the widows. The early church was plagued with all kinds of controversies. Look at Corinth. They were shielding a guy who's having relations with his dad's wife, and they overcame that. Paul and Peter, even the apostles had controversies within their relationships, but their friendship survived. They agreed to disagree, and they went their separate ways. But then when it came time to come back, they did what? They came back and they worked for the better of the good. It's okay to have disagreements. Sometimes we're afraid, it'll drive people away. I can't tell you how many places that I've been across the country that I've went out to eat with people, and they talk about either a time in the past, or they talk about a current time where it seems to be the common theme where there's a certain brother there at the congregation who has a certain level of influence, and nobody wants to discipline him for fear of reprisal or for fear of him taking, because they often have deep pockets, if you will. They don't want them taking their church contributions somewhere else. So they refrain from, they tiptoe around the issues, if you will, whatever they may be, for fear of upsetting that individual. That's not the way that we ought to manage the church. That's not the way we ought to manage our Christian lives. And that they'll be afraid that they'll be afraid that they'll reject our efforts. Paul stood and said, "Therefore I testify to you this day that I'm innocent of the blood of all men." That's what Paul said. Even though Paul had people killed. That didn't stop Paul from doing what Paul needed to do. nor should it stop us from doing what we need to do and administering the laws of God in order to or in administering or being a New Testament church. We also find ourselves afraid to take sides in controversies, afraid of accusations of bias. Well, you're only saying that because you're his friend or her friend or whatever that case may be. When it comes down to often issues, as far as scriptural issues, there's either you're on the Lord's side or you're not on the Lord's side. Some controversies do not have a right and wrong. Look at Paul and Barnabas. It wasn't right or but they Paul thought that John Mark shouldn't. Some thought they should. And it was okay, was it not? They went their separate ways for a period of time. And when it comes to controversies, you got to be careful too. Sometimes we become so entrained in them, we instead of being heard, all we do is we fight to be right. And we go and we thrust ourselves upon our sword, and it might be nothing. Do you really want to fall on your sword over what color to paint the wall of the auditorium, or what color to put a carpet to put in the church? Is that or the building? That is that something that you really want to fall upon your sword? I don't think so. But that has divided some. Many others do not have a right or wrong side. Sometimes things are just a matter of judgment. We should take the right side, regardless of who's on it. I'm sorry. Others do have a right and wrong side, and we should stand on the right side, regardless of who's on it. 2 Timothy chapter 4, verses 16 and 17 says, "At my first offense, no one stood with me, but all forsook me. May it not be charged against them, but the Lord stood with me and strengthened me, so that the message might be preached fully through me, and that all Gentiles might hear. Also, I was delivered out of the mouth of the lion." There might come a day that religious persecution comes to the United States. There could become a day to where freedom of religion and that right goes away. If it does, what side would you be on? If the church was really being persecuted, or if the law came in through the doors to start arresting people, where would you find yourself standing? Just about done. And Christians are often paralyzed because they're afraid to say what is needed. They're afraid they'll say the wrong thing, or it'll come out the wrong way. If we're on the Lord's side, then it doesn't matter. Granted, there are sometimes more effective ways to say things, and if you find yourself being a person who doesn't often say things maybe the best way, maybe they come out a little too coarse or whatnot, then get some help. Look at Moses. Moses said, Lord, I can't do that. I can't speak very good. Okay, we'll take your brother Aaron. He's a good speaker. But it shouldn't paralyze us from doing what needs to be done. Consider Ecclesiastes 3, verse 7. It says, "A time to tear and a time to sow, a time to keep silent and a time to speak." So yeah, sometimes we need to just keep our mouth shut. Maybe that's not the best time to address those issues, especially when people are very heated about things. Sometimes you just got to let people calm down, then go and address them when they're in a better frame of mind, if you will. But nonetheless, we still should be willing to address those things. It is true that more say too much than too little. Sometimes we let our tempers get the best of us, and sometimes we could be on the right side of the issue, but because we say too much, or because again we're arguing to be right, not arguing to be heard, we become ineffective in our communication. So sometimes there is an art to it. James chapter 1 verse 26 says, if anyone among you thinks he is religious and does not bridle his tongue, but deceives his own heart, this one's religion is useless. So yeah, we don't have to address every issue in the heat of the argument. And it's just as bad to say too little as it is to say too much. So again, sometimes there's a fine line to walk. And that's why we appoint elders. These men are supposed to be seasoned, have dealt with some controversies in their lives, and sometimes we need to defer to them. We don't have to champion every cause, especially as a young man. Usually that male bravado wants to be the first one to jump up there and defend the honor of everybody. But sometimes that's not the best position that you ought to be in. Sometimes you need to defer to the older that are wiser and more seasoned in dealing with the issues at hand. It's all situational dependent. But the point is that we shouldn't allow ourselves to become so fearful of these situations that we become paralyzed. In the end, we need to learn to be effective Christians. And we could be afraid of aggressively pursuing the work of the church, fearful that we will slip up and get it wrong. So afraid of supporting the wrong preacher, so therefore we don't support any preachers. Or so afraid of helping, deadbeats. Well, we're not there to monitor that individual, so we shouldn't support them. That's what when we support somebody. Yeah, we're not there to monitor. We're not there to. Often men send reports back and say this is what we're doing. But that, if they're misusing those funds, that's on them, not on us. That shouldn't keep us from trying to further the gospel in other areas of the world. Or that we become so afraid of using the wrong tools of edification. We shouldn't resort to gimmickry, but we should utilize technology, and we should utilize whatever communication tools at our disposal. Like we used the live stream, or we used the projector. We used to use a newspaper, but now we use Facebook to get the word out. We shouldn't be fearful of leveraging technology in order to get the word out that the East Cambridge Church of Christ is here, and that we welcome people here that want to study the Word of God. But some places men become so fearful. I remember one of my grandfathers that he didn't want any new device being brought into the church because he thought that the next thing that was the first step of going over the cliff, if you will. That if they brought in a projector, the next thing that an overhead projector, the next thing that was going to happen, they were going to be showing movies. And that's not the case. That's not the case. So don't allow ourselves to become paralyzed in spreading the gospel. If we're doing it wrong, yes, that's one thing, but we shouldn't. We should leverage the tools that we have to the best of our abilities to communicate out to the world that we can. We don't want to become stricken with fear and not utilize those assets. You know, consider the one talent man. He was disciplined because he was what? He was afraid. Oh Lord, I was afraid that I would lose your coin, so I went and buried it. He didn't want to leverage the market. He didn't want to leverage the banks. He didn't want to leverage anything to further the 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 uh, the master's resources. So he just went and buried the coin, and he was the one that was chastened. He was the one that was scorned because he didn't put the work, those things that he was entrusted with. So we don't want to be a one talent Christian, if you will, when it comes to doing the work of the church. So as we wrap up, yeah, we can become crippled with fear. That's a harsh reality of life. There's no doubt. And we should take the necessary precautions to do all things right. Again, we're not arguing here that we should be haphazard in ministering the affairs of the church or ministering the affairs of being a parent or living as a Christian. That's not the point of this argument. God will bless us our efforts to do his will. God will forgive us of our mistakes if we make mistakes. That's what 1 John 1:7-2:1 is all about. We're going to make mistakes. The point is, we don't want to become paralyzed to where we do nothing, or that we end up doing things that are very counterproductive to furthering the will of God. So don't be afraid of obeying the gospel. And that's what this time's all about. This is your time. Instead, we ought to be afraid, be afraid that you will not hold out to the end, that you will not endure, that you'll find yourself backsliding away. Or perhaps you're already in that process. Because all things are here, all things are prepared, whether to become a Christian for the first time or if you're already a Christian and perhaps you're not living the life that you ought to be. Don't be paralyzed and be fearful of coming forward and responding to that gospel call. Instead, come forward as we stand and sing the songs of the church.